Okay, Dad, I just want to finish this game. Okay, Dad, I'm coming. Yeah, I'm almost at the end. What happened to summer?
Final Fantasy.
Hello everyone, and welcome back to the Ultimate Super Nintendo review here on Player One Start. Previously in this series, we took a look at the history and development of the Super Nintendo, as well as some of the tech specs, and we started looking at the launch lineup in the previous video. And in this video, we're going to continue taking a look at the games that were released before the end of 1991. November of 1991 saw a plethora of titles hit the system, representing a few more game genres, and a few iconic titles that I still play to this day. Paperboy 2 is a port of the arcade game of the same name, and performs exactly how I would expect it to. It's not as good as the first one. Other reviews of this game have not been so kind. I've seen ratings as low as 20% or 1 out of 5. And I don't consider it to be that terrible, but if I had paid full price for this way back in the day, yeah, I would have been disappointed too. In retrospective reviews, 20 to 30 years later, this game has not been received that badly, but it still receives around a 6 out of 10. ActRaiser is a bit of a surprise for me because I wasn't quite sure what to expect. It is a platform and city building game that was developed by Quintet and published by Enix. In this game, you take the role of the Master, who is the main protagonist of the game, and although the Master is never directly controlled, the player interacts with the world by controlling an angel and an animated statue. You control an angel during the simulation sequences of the game, and you control the animated statue when you're going through the platforming sections. What surprised me about this game is just how much I ended up enjoying it. I thought this was purely a simulation kind of game, and maybe you were able to interact it in like the side-scrolling levels a bit more. And if I had to say which style of gameplay I preferred more, it is the platforming sections, especially considering this first theme. Which is by legendary game composer Yuzo Koshiro. The rest of the soundtrack is good, but nothing as good as this track is. This is my favorite from the entire game. Overall, I really dig this game, and I'm very glad I got an original copy for my Super Nintendo, but it is also available on modern platforms through its remaster. The fact that John Madden Football came out so close to the launch of the Super Nintendo is indicative of the 16-bit war that was going on between Nintendo and Sega. This game took the world by storm on the Sega Genesis and quickly became the killer app for the system in a pre-Sonic the Hedgehog era. But even though this game shares the same name as the original, it actually also incorporates things from the sequel, John Madden Football 92, that was released the same year on the Genesis. Something interesting about this game is that they didn't have the full licensing from the NFL to use team names and everything, so instead every team is represented by their colors and their city name. This game itself is revolutionary for being the most realistic football game released to date, but in retrospect there are definitely better games on this system with the sequels rather than the original. My biggest critique of this game in modern times is that the frame rate is just a bit too choppy for my taste. I think that's due to Electronic Arts trying to port the Genesis game over without really optimizing it for the Super Nintendo. I'm not quite sure about that though. But really, I just wanted to try this game out because of its historical significance, and the fact that this game was in development for years by EA after licensing the rights to John Madden's name and likeness, and he wouldn't let him release the game until they were able to put a game that could display all the players on the field at the same time, which took till about 1990 to happen. So not a bad game in itself, but definitely one that was improved upon with future sequels. But yes, I will acknowledge how big of a deal it was that EA was able to publish this game on both the Genesis and the Super Nintendo, at a time when third-party licensing, especially on Nintendo's end, prohibited games from being put on other systems. John Madden's Football was a rare exception at the very beginning of the Super Nintendo's life cycle, I think mainly because of how popular it was on the Genesis, and Nintendo needed to have something similar to it, or just a port of the game like they ended up doing, in order to compete with Sega. RPM Racing, or Radical Psycho Machine Racing, was developed by Silicon and Synapse, now known as Blizzard Entertainment, and published by Interplay Productions. This game is a remake of a Commodore 64 title called Racing Destruction Set that was developed by Electronic Arts in 1985, and I think that statement in itself explains this game and makes it make a bit more sense, at least to me. As I've stated in the past, I am not a fan of isometric perspective racing games. It can control okay, but that isometric perspective and the screen crunch is not something I like to deal with anymore. Some people may find this nostalgic, but it just wasn't for me, so I'm gonna go ahead and say pass on this one. True Golf Classics, Waialae Country Club was a golfing game developed and published by T&E Soft. This was released back in the day when releasing one whole entire but accurately recreated golf course was apparently enough to warrant its own game. The game is very straightforward as a golfing simulator, where you're able to choose a golfer, assign a caddy, pick a set of golf clubs, and then for the most part you're free to play throughout the course. The gameplay style of this game reminds me a lot of Microsoft Golf, which I have played a lot more often when it was on PC, so for that reason I found it a bit nostalgic. Otherwise, I would say this is about a 6 out of 10, 7 out of 10 solid game, but I would mostly recommend this to fans of golfing games as it's not really accessible to everybody. Super Tennis was very well received when it first came out in 1991, and it's a game that a lot of people like to come back to. Definitely is tennis, and I definitely did enjoy this game as a weekend rental as a kid, and something that I don't mind coming back to here on the Super Nintendo, as it does fill me with a lot of fond nostalgic memories of playing this game as a kid. Final Fight is a side-scrolling beat-em-up video game produced by Capcom, originally released in the arcades in 1989. Set in the fictional Metro City, the game lets the player control one of three Street Fighters, a former pro wrestler and city mayor, Mike Hagar, expert brawler Cody Travers, and modern-day ninja, Guy. The trio set out to rescue Jessica, which is Hagar's daughter and Cody's girlfriend, when she is kidnapped by the Mad Gear Gang. A note of trivia is that this game was originally developed to be a sequel to the original Street Fighter released in 1987 under the working title Street Fighter 89. However, the game genre was switched from a fighting game to a beat-em-up, and the title was changed to Final Fight following the success of Double Dragon. This game is phenomenal in terms of being a side-scrolling beat-em-up game. I really enjoyed this back in the day as a rental, and I think this game holds up well today thanks to its art style and well-designed gameplay. Definitely a welcome addition to the early lineup on the Super Nintendo. And of course, Final Fantasy II is an iconic title that released for the Super Nintendo. However, it is not one that I remember being this huge smash hit on the system. As a kid, I was aware of what the Final Fantasy series was, but I had never played one, at least not until around 2001, starting with Final Fantasy VII. However, when I first started collecting games for the Super Nintendo, this is one of the earliest games I collected, and I couldn't put it down once I started playing. The medieval setting, the classic battle system, the stylistic pixel art, the music and sound, and the epic and surprisingly engaging story for a Super Nintendo game all come together to make this one of the best RPG experiences I have ever played on the Super Nintendo. If you are a fan of the series, or a fan of RPGs in general, this is a definite must-have for your collection. And if you're just even a casual fan of role-playing games, this is one I can see the casual player getting into a lot easier than some of the other titles. I mean, if this game genre isn't your thing and you don't like reading, this may not be your game altogether, but I can't strongly recommend this game enough. Definitely a large improvement over the first Final Fantasy, and considering that this is actually the fourth game, as we skipped 2 and 3 here in North America, the improvement over the first Final Fantasy game becomes that much more apparent. And yes, this is one of the few Final Fantasy plays I found myself going back and playing through again just because I enjoyed it so much. Super Ghouls and Ghosts was a much-anticipated title, which is a bit harder to realize these days because this series has all but disappeared out of the public consciousness. But right when this game was released is about where the series had peaked in terms of popularity. The original arcade game being ported to the Nintendo Entertainment System was a game I had constantly played over at my grandma's house because that was one of the games she had there, and this game would have been one I had rented a lot on the Super Nintendo, but I still have more nostalgia for the first one, mainly because that was the first one I played. This game does vastly improve on the series formula by taking full advantage of the Super Nintendo's new capabilities, and I think the strong art direction really helps this game hold up well, but the biggest reason why a lot of people may not want to play this game is just because it is infamously difficult. You may be throwing your controller and banging your head against the wall several times before you beat this game, but even though this game is challenging, I never really find it being completely unfair to the point where they were just trying to get you to pump your quarters in more. It is that type of challenging difficulty that is rarely pulled off well. Definitely a good game to have in your library, especially if you're a fan of the genre. But just beware, a lot of people buy this and just let it collect dust in their collection, but every once in a while I like pulling it out just to torture some people and say, hey, you want to try this game? Yeah, I heard it's pretty easy. But they stopped trusting me on that after I was doing that all the time with Battletoads. Darius Twin is another side-scrolling shooter, again surprisingly how many there were on this system very early on, but the only copy I own at the moment is actually for the Super Famicom. This game series, developed by Taito, was a very well-regarded series in the early 1990s, and after playing it for myself, it was easy to see why. In addition to having all the traditional elements you would expect to see in a side-scrolling shooter, the game's soundtrack, art style, and well-designed gameplay really made it hard to put down for me. And even though there's a large amount of objects on screen, I didn't notice the slowdown as much with this game as I did with other ones. In retrospect, this game has been regarded as one of the 100 best games that were released on the Super Nintendo, with of course the number one noted criticism being the difficulty. Game reviews have softened over time, but I would give this a solid 8 out of 10 and recommend it to anyone who's a fan of the genre. Even if it's a casual one, this would offer you a good playthrough. But if you're more of a hardcore fan that really enjoy the challenge, this also would fit for you as well, just bump up the difficulty a bit. And just like Palpatine, let the rage flow through you. December would yield a few more games released for the Super Nintendo, but with varying results. Bill Laimbeer's Combat Basketball is kind of a unique game concept. It is listed as a futuristic basketball game released by Hudson Soft for the Super Nintendo in 1991, and yes, this game has the distinction of being the first basketball game released for the Super Nintendo. The game stars the titled Detroit Piston from the NBA during a time when that team was notorious for aggressive and dirty physical play. The game takes place in the year 2031, which sounds a lot farther away than 9 years at the time of this review, but here we are, where Bill Laimbeer has become commissioner of the basketball league and fired all of the referees and created a play of style without rules. There are no fouls in this game, and the use of weapons is perfectly legal. The game utilizes an uncommon overhead view of the court, and unlike real basketball, players can physically check each other on the court without the threat of personal or team fouls. So destructive items such as bombs frequently appear on the court, which you can use against other players. The game concept sounds kind of fun, right? Nothing could go wrong? Well, unfortunately it didn't really work out that way. The game received many negative reviews when it first came out, criticizing the graphics, sound, and controls, with one reviewer specifically noting that the game's faults mar what would have been a guilty pleasure to play. That review kind of sums it up in my opinion. I definitely can't recommend this game, and is one I think is best avoided. Super Baseball Simulator 1000 also sounds like a futuristic sports title, but it's actually more of a modern-day baseball simulator. This game is okay and entirely playable, but again, just like early sports game titles on the Super Nintendo, there are other games that I think are a bit better, so this one I'm not as particularly fond of. I'd give it about a 6 out of 10. I find Lagoon to be an interesting case scenario on the Super Nintendo. First off, it is listed as a top-view action-adventure video game, which is likely true, but it has some RPG elements integrated into it. When I first booted up the game, I thought that maybe I'd made a mistake, as I could have swore I played this game before, but from the title alone, this is my first time playing this game, and it turns out, all the reviews of this also mention this, that the game is very similar to the game Ys. The combat style and RPG progression is almost exactly the same as some of the early Ys games that I've played, the most recent of which I played on the TurboGrafx 16, and this game reminds me a lot of that game. So if you're a fan of those action side-scrolling RPGs of the early 90s, this one would be a good one to attempt. My personal experience with this game, though, was I spent a while playing it, but I didn't really get very far, and I lost interest pretty quickly. Definitely not the style of RPG that I'm most fond of playing from this era. Super Off-Road was originally released as an arcade game in 1989 and eventually made its way to the Super Nintendo Entertainment System. In this game, you can compete against another player or just the computer while you race around several top-view indoor off-road racetracks of increasing difficulty. This version on the Super Nintendo had 16 different tracks. As you play through the game, you can earn points to continue in the championship, and money in which you can upgrade your truck, or buy nitro, which can make your truck go faster. The goal is to continue racing until you reach the end of the racing season, with having earned the most money and points. This game was well received at launch by fans, and it's one that I used to rent back in the day and play with my brother. Overall, I do find it nostalgic, even though I'm not a huge fan of the top-down perspective in modern days. I think it's that arcade pick-up-and-play style that I really do enjoy, just to come back to this game for a little bit and play off and on. And this is a game I'd recommend playing with 2 players rather than against the computer, as I feel that the races can get boring and repetitive very quickly. Overall, I give this game a 6 or a 7 out of 10. Again, not something I would consider essential for your collection, but something that I enjoy going back to, and would recommend to the right person. Super Castlevania IV was a much-anticipated game when the Super Nintendo was still brand new. The Castlevania series had gained popularity on Nintendo's Entertainment System, and fans of the series were wondering what the first entry on the Super Nintendo would be like. And overall, for fans of the series, it would not disappoint. In this game, you take control of Simon Belmont as he makes his way through 11 different levels in a side-scrolling platform game on your quest as a vampire hunter to defeat the ultimate vampire, Count Dracula. The game's graphics got the 16-bit upgrade that many were looking forward to, including a couple of uses of Mode 7, and the musical score would be mostly rehashed pieces from previous Castlevania games, but updated with the Super Nintendo sound chip. In terms of gameplay, the style is very similar from other Castlevania games with some improvements added in. For example, Simon's whip can now attack in 8 different directions with the use of the control pad. Also, you can wave around your whip to deflect projectiles. In terms of my personal experience with this game, I wish I could tell you about the many weekends I spent renting this game for my Super Nintendo back in the day, but sadly that is not the way I first experienced this game. I didn't know about this series until the early 2000s when I started playing games in emulation. So while this is not one I remember from my childhood, this is a good game I like coming back to. Although be careful, some of the platforming in this game can be quite frustrating and annoying, but it's definitely rewarding when you can get through it. Overall, I would recommend this game and would give it around an 8 or a 9 out of 10 as one of the better games to release in 1991, and it seemed both classic and contemporary reviews agree with that assessment, as well as the affection of this game for it to be released several times on different platforms. I previously covered Home Alone in its own video when I talked about all the different versions of Home Alone that released across the Super Nintendo, Sega Genesis, and other platforms. To summarize my thoughts here, really I thought this game was designed as a cheap cash grab just to use the Home Alone license to get people to buy the video game. Really what you're supposed to do in this game is to collect all of your treasures from around the house and move them down to the safe room in the basement. You're supposed to avoid the wet bandits while you do this, and you can't actually take them out, but you can stun them. Overall, a game that I wish I hadn't played and is definitely skippable. I've seen this game get a review score of 6 out of 10, but I think that's being generous, at least in my experience. Miracle Piano is a piece of software that was designed to teach kids how to play the piano using their Super Nintendo. I previously covered this for the Nintendo Entertainment System, and although I have the keyboard, I actually don't have the dongle that connects my keyboard to the Super Nintendo, just to the Nintendo Entertainment System. So I couldn't really give this game a proper review, except for if you want to check out my NES video, I would recommend that. D-Force is a vertical scrolling shooter video game. In this game, you control an Apache helicopter with the goal of defeating an evil Middle Eastern dictator. I wonder if this game was inspired by the Gulf War in any way. There are 7 different levels in this game which feature 6 different countries. Some of the levels involve switching altitudes in order to attack enemies from a different height, and along with the takeoff sequences, those use the Mode 7. Overall, while I usually enjoy a good shoot-'em-up game, this one is just mediocre. It controls fairly well, but it is a fairly straightforward and standard shoot-'em-up, without anything that really stands out to me personally. I did notice throughout my gameplay that the game really seemed to stutter at certain times without having a really good frame rate, and it only got worse when there were more enemies on the screen. Again, especially compared to some of the other shooters that would eventually release on the platform, and even ones that released in 1991, it really just seems bland and generic without really much thought going into it. And since this is my first time playing it, it's not really a title that really stuck out to me. That said, had this been a game I rented in 1991 for my Super Nintendo with a limited number of titles available, I would have been ecstatic to play this game, and probably would have rated it at around a 7 or an 8 out of 10. In the modern day, with almost full access to the Super Nintendo's game library, I would say that this would rank around a 6 out of 10 for me. I've seen the same trend in game reviews from when this game first released to modern days, softening a bit and even calling this game flat out bad. Again, in my experience, it's just mediocre, more along the bottom end of average. So again, I would only recommend this to hardcore fans of shoot-'em-ups, but I wouldn't go out of my way to collect this one. And there you have it. That is every title that hit the Super Nintendo the year that it launched in 1991. Out of these later titles, I think the number 1 standout title out of all of these is Final Fantasy II. This is the one that I have come back to a lot of times to come back and play as the quintessential turn-based Final Fantasy from this time period. But if you take a look at the entire lineup as a whole, including the launch games and the early games that released for the system, this is a pretty solid lineup. But Nintendo still had a lot of ground to cover, as the Sega Genesis and TurboGrafx both had about 2 years to gain a foothold in the market, and these titles by themselves wouldn't quite do it. But in terms of speaking on what the Super Nintendo was supposed to deliver, I think that Nintendo had a gallery of games that showcased what was technically possible on the Super Nintendo that their competitors couldn't accomplish. However, they also had a surprising number of games that had already reached other platforms, and here I have some of my personal favorites and games I've gone back to several times on this system, although missing from this shot is Super Castlevania IV as well as Super Off-Road. But that is just my opinion. What did you guys think of the games I showcased in today's episode? If you've played any of these games, please let me know in the comments below. Also let me know if there are any that you saw in here that you haven't played that you think look interesting. In the next part in this series, we're going to start taking a look at games by genre. And unlike the last 2 consoles that I covered, the TurboGrafx 16 and the Neo Geo, I'm not going to be able to cover every single game, or even the majority, because there are just so many. So I am going to focus on some of my personal favorites, some of those popular ones, and maybe I'll throw in a couple of hidden gems. So stay tuned for that video coming out to you real soon. If you like this video and you'd like to help out with future projects on this channel, please consider supporting me on Patreon. A special thanks to those Patreons you see on screen. Also, if you like what you see, please remember to leave a like and click that subscribe button on your way out. As always, I want to thank you all so much for watching, and I will see you all in the next video.